Welcome to the Women in Vinyl podcast with Jen DiEugenio, founder of Women in Vinyl and contributor Robin Raymond. This podcast facilitates conversations with those working in the vinyl record industry to educate, demystify, and diversify the vinyl community.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 46 of the Women in Vinyl podcast and the last of 2023. You just heard Part-Time Drummer by the all-female 9-piece brass band, the Brass Queens, from Brooklyn, New York, inspired by the New Orleans tradition. Their newest album, Black and Gold, is out now via www.brassqueensnyc.com/online store. It's our final episode of the year, and we're closing it out on the thoughtful topic of diversification of vinyl. We're looking at the topic not only from an employment, but collector view. We sat down with Women in Vinyl Advisory Board member, educator, author, and researcher, Dr. Veronica Skrimsjö, to discuss what she has uncovered on the topic, why certain generalizations and stereotypes happen, and what we can do to break them down. Learn more on this topic and check out her upcoming publication, The Vinyl Revival, Gender and Collecting Aesthetics. In the meantime, you can buy her first release, I, Me, Mine, an initial consideration of popular music record, collecting aesthetics, identities, and practices. Find links in the show notes for more, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Would you please introduce yourself and let everybody know how you got into vinyl?
So I am Dr. Veronica Skrimsjö. I write a lot about records. I teach a lot about records and popular music. I got into vinyl in, I think it was about April 2001, because I was living on a farm and got bored, and my dad had a huge record collection. And I thought, well, we haven't connected the turntable or the speakers or anything, and that could take me a couple of hours to do. So it was just about the technical side of things and having something to do. And once I achieved that, I thought, well, I should test it. I should see if it actually works. And I found Rubber Soul, and I thought the cover looked really cool. So I thought, well, that'll do. And yeah, that was it. Never looked back.
Wow. That's, I mean, considering the wall of records you have behind you, that says something. Either you're a profound hoarder, or you just dove in with reckless abandon, which I'm totally here for both, obviously.
Yeah, I might have plastered my walls in that bedroom with Beatles lyrics.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
And you are on the Women in Vinyl
Moved to
board.
Liverpool because of it as well. Sorry.
No, that's
What,
awesome.
Veronica?
Oh no, I moved to Liverpool because of it as well. It was just everything on at once.
Oh, wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Well, you're on the Women in Vinyl board, and we're very thankful to have you. And you are an educator. And we were going to talk about the book that you have coming out next year. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So I knew I wanted to write something about vinyl again, because it's just, I've realized it's my research area. It was It's what I like doing, so I might as well kind of keep going at it. And I was thinking, well, what is it that needs saying more? And I kept toying with the idea for a while. And I went back and reviewed all of my old books that I used for the first book, and felt that, well, they were still perpetuating all of those things about gender, and we weren't getting away from it. And I dove into more contemporary discourse, and I found it's still the same thing. We're still saying exactly the same things about record collecting being essentially 99% male. And I thought, well, I've never recognized that reality. And I thought if we just had discussions about record collecting, we'd realize that that wasn't the case, and had the moment of realization of, no, that's not happening. So if no one else is going to say it, then I'm going to say it. So really set into, okay, let's talk about record collecting right now in 21st century with the vinyl revival. That's handy. And let's address that thing of gender really, really clearly. And at least then I've made my peace with it.
Yeah, it's super interesting because we had Carolyn on the podcast last year who, wrote about sort of this gender bias. And I'm curious because you mentioned that some of the other ones bias are starting to kind of, or stereotypes are starting to kind of dissipate. What were some of those other ones, and why do you think that those are starting to go away where gender isn't?
I think we have a lot more access to the different communities. So we can see that it's not just the people who go to our record shops that are collectors and interested in vinyl. And the sales figures speak for themselves. So even if you're not really into it, there's so much press about who's buying records that you really have to work hard at not recognizing that there are more people than just the ones you see around you kind of buying it. But I think the issue with gender, from my point of view, it's been like the biggest hurdle. There are still issues in terms of other kind of identities, but gender seems to be the one that's sticking the hardest. And I think that has to do with the crossover of sexualization of technology and women, and kind of objectifying women into technology. So by being a female record collector or a woman presenting record collector, that's a challenge to so many areas that it becomes very, very tricky.
So interesting.
Yeah, well, and it probably you're finding corollaries in, like, when you're saying technology, like cars, and not specifically turntables, but what other areas of tech are you seeing that kind of perpetuates?
So yeah, cars is a big one as well. There's been a lot of work in the popular music studies community in terms of just audio gear generally, and any kind of production. So if we're talking a music studio, very, very kind of gendered area, and very difficult for women to get into. Anything that involves plugging things into things and pushing buttons, apparently that's dangerous.
Well, and Veronica, how do you think, because like if you look back into like the 40s and 50s, like women were primarily the record collectors, the record buying, because they were responsible for getting like the consoles, and because it was looked at as furniture, right? So because they were hosting parties and whatever in their houses, they were like, oh, this record player fits into my life, into my design. And so how do you think that changed, where we were the primary focus with that, and like being the record, like the tastemakers, and into like this gap of the like this minefield of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then now we're here where we're like, oh no, we've been here all along. But what have you found anything in your research that shows why there is that kind of like, we were here and then we kind of disappeared into the background, and then we're kind of trying to claw our ways back out?
So the biggest thing I would say comes from just collecting studies in general, because all of the statistics indicate that when we're children, women, men, non-binary people collect in kind of completely equal amounts and kind of very similar patterns. Then during adolescence, that's when things start to change in the perception of collecting, not in the actual practice. So for women presenting people, they collect more domestically and privately, whereas men's collections become more of a public display, and it becomes that thing of capital culture of showing up of, look at me, I have all of this stuff, therefore I'm important. And that's kind of the opposite behavior of women. And that leads on into adulthood, where again, it's about domestic items, and the domestic space has never been seen as equally important as the public space. So women who collect cosmetics and things like that, we don't usually talk about it as a collection because it's just makeup. So it becomes less important. And it's kind of similar in terms of records, that, okay, yeah, you might be collecting records, but you're really just doing it to enhance your home, and therefore it's not as important. Whereas when a man does it, it's because he's really interested in music, or he wants to further his music education somehow, become a better guitarist or whatever it might be. So it's always that kind of association of the domestic space that we're kind of being confined to.
And do you think that has, because now we have these tiny little snapshots into our lives that we think that everybody cares about with like Instagram and whatever, do you think that that's maybe one of the reasons? Because now we're all very much like, oh, look at me, look at me.
I think that's had an impact, and I think Instagram is or women have mastered Instagram very well, and in lots of ways kind of claim that space. I think that was helpful. I know for me as well, it's been a lot easier kind of just opening the app and going, well, look at all of these other women who are collecting. So there's definitely that space. I also think that if we look at the number of kind of new pressed records, kind of the contemporary stuff that's being released, that is predominantly being purchased by young women. So that statistic also helps very much, which then unfortunately leads to a discussion of, well, if they're just buying the latest Taylor Swift and Harry Styles, then they're not real record collectors. Also problematic, but at least it kind of gets a discussion going and saying, well, they are buying, and they're buying in huge amounts, so we need to consider that.
Yeah. I mean, to Robin's point, and also to what you're saying too, I find like, I was sharing a lot of my collection really frequently for a period of time a few years back. And I've noticed that over the last year, I mean, granted, I've had a lot going on, but there's been things that I've sort of pulled back from that being a priority, because it almost felt like it became competitive, or like without, like, I didn't want that. That's not ever what I was trying to do, especially with like the Black Sabbath stuff. I have these guys that like come out of the woodwork and they're just like, oh, well, do you have this one? Why don't you have this one? Or like, trying to like one up like how many I have, or like, this is something I got into because I wanted to like explore it. I love this band, and it's just become like a competition for who has more Black Sabbath. And I just, and it just feels like icky. I don't know. I don't like it. And so I've just kind of like not been posting as much, which kind of sucks, because I feel like that community was something that's really special. So, and maybe that's the difference in how, we share or want to be in this community, male versus female.
Yeah, I think that the number of records is also still a huge sticking point of, you have to have the most, so you have to have everything. And even though I've done the PhD, I teach on it, I've got the credentials on paper to say I'd know a thing or two about record collecting. When we start discussing these things with new people, they always go, oh, well, I've got so many records. And I go, okay, that's super interesting, I've got more. But so it's still this, you have to like showcase of, yeah, but I've got 1,500. It's like, okay, well, that's great, super. But,
right.
I mean, it's become the new, like, take it out and measure it, in my opinion. And like, that's one of the things that I hate so much about it. But the other question that I have is, like, we come back to this statistic a lot of times, and especially in the retail environment right now, where 50% of the record buying population don't even have turntables. So when do you become a collector? And like, what is the definition, I guess, of collecting? Is it just amassing the thing, or is it, playing the thing and like enjoying the thing, or is it just like he who dies with the most toys dies with the most. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like that whole, like, the guys that collect like little figurines, and I mean not just guys but people that collect little figurines and leave them in the boxes too. Like, I'm sure that there's a whole crap ton of records that are still in shrink wrap in people's Kallaxes around the world. But does that make them a collector? Is there, like, I mean, I hate the concept of this, but is there like another identifier that we can give to people that, that have sealed records versus people that play their records? Like, that drives me insane.
So for me, I've always said that whoever wants to define themselves as a collector is a collector, because that was also a barrier that I noticed, that a lot of men were being defined as collectors, whereas women, because they were more hesitant to take on that label, they were kind of pushed aside and not included in any literature. So again, that of not just imposing titles on people and being respectful of it might come with a lot of baggage of you don't want to be associated with as a collector. So let's discuss the practices instead. But generally speaking, in terms of differentiating collecting from hoarding, hoarding is characterized by shame. And collecting is never characterized by shame. So even if you have them in shrink wrap, and I've got a couple of figurines and boxes behind me.
Oh, I do too. I do too. I have a whole bunch of pops.
Yeah. It's that of, well, are we displaying it with pride, and are we willing to talk about it with the right people, perhaps? But then that's different. And within vinyl, I think it's really important to think about consumption against the grain, because recorded music has always been about consumption against the grain. I mean, even the concept, recording sound wasn't made for music, but we made it that way. So within the record, if we want to consume it because the sleeve is cool, then let's do that. Then let that be the defining factor. But I also think that means that some people don't understand that it's not just music, it's not just an artifact. It can be music and an artifact at the same time.
What other sorts of like threads did you find through your research as far as gender, but then also just collecting in general, on the topic?
Well, like I said, generally there's no differences in the number of people who collect in terms of gender. It's like men and women, trans identities collect in equal amounts the same way, when we kind of make appropriate adjustments. There might be some differences in the practices though. Again, kind of the social nature of, are you doing it because you want to become a better musician, or are you doing it because of some other reason? So that term musician has also been quite loaded for a lot of people, including myself. Of first thing I get asked of, well, if you're a record collector, do you play music or do you play an instrument? And if I say yes, then somehow that's okay. But if I say no, then it's like, oh, but why does it matter? Do you have to have all those records? So the term musician becomes very, very important. Yeah. And then kind of how we're purchasing records as well. Things are changing very, very slowly, but that was another thing that I felt like I really needed to address in the book, of the space of the record shop, because we always talk about the record shop being such an important site for education, and it is in many ways, but it's also a really important site for discrimination. So it just, thankfully, I have a great local record shop, and even though it's kind of specializing in a little bit more alternative stuff, there's never a case of, oh, you can't come in here, you're not welcome. Anything is welcome, and always have a discussion there. And that's what it should be like. But go a bit further into the city centre, and, had very different experiences where the people in the shop refuse to speak to me. They'll only speak to my husband, even when he tells them, no, you need to speak to Veronica. She's the one who's here buying records. I'm just tagging along. But they still refuse to address me with anything. So kind of acknowledging that the space plays a part. And if it is this important space that can enhance the culture and that can kind of introduce new people to it, then we also have to think about how to address when they're really, really bad and toxic spaces and when they're excluding people.
Yeah. And that was going to be one of my follow-up questions too, is like, we made that differentiation between like hoarding and shame and that kind of thing. But if you go into a record store and you have a really negative experience, and maybe that's like your closest one, has that translated, do you think, into more purchases on Discogs and like Facebook Marketplace and like secondary solutions to try to find the records that some of these new collectors are trying to find?
Definitely. I mean, there's always ways of getting the records if you want them, even if it's like popping to different record fairs and things like that. And that's the way I used to do it, because I hated going into record shops. I couldn't stand it. So I would always find alternative ways. So when people would say, oh, but we don't see these people in the record shops, I went, well, of course not. Why would I go there? But yeah, Discogs has been huge. Luminate came out with their mid-year numbers about 2 months ago that said that direct-to-consumer sales have gone up above kind of market expectations. So to me, that's a clear signal that, you know, these women or other marginalized identities are kind of going to those places because they don't have to face the judgment there.
Yeah, I read that report as well, and I found it really interesting. And then going into the record store that I work at, doing ordering for Black Friday and for like the new release titles that we have through Universal, there was an artist who dumped all of their, I guess, leftover tour stock or their leftover D2C stock into their label so that any of the independent record stores could buy it. And I was like, oh, that's weird. That's what? I was like, that's opposite. Like, that's not direct to consumer at all. But like, do you think that they also maybe saw those numbers and are like, oh, maybe we should take these variants that we made specifically for the tour and now put them into record stores? Or like,
possibly, yeah, or possibly overestimated how many variants you needed based on some other successful people.
I mean, that's an entire conversation on its own, completely. But yeah, that direct to consumer thing is always like an interesting kind of moment, because it is very much like the fan like interacting with their person, you know what I mean? And like like doing a limited edition picture disc or whatever, and then just having it available on your Bandcamp and like having that exchange, I think has led to a little bit more of a, I don't know, a preciousness of whatever the result is, you know, like maybe enhancing the collector experience a little bit. Do you think?
Yeah, and I think as well, I mean, David Crosby is one of my favorite guitarist singers, and before he died, he was very vocal about this idea of buy it from my web shop, please help me, you know, I need the money. And you know, obviously he wasn't the most popular when he died, but he had a very long career and in many ways like set these expectations within a rock genre. So you'd think that he would have made enough money to not have to tell people, I need you to buy it from my web shop. But I think that kind of frank discussion and really drawing the connections for consumers of, if you do this, that directly benefits me. If you do this other thing, then I'm not seeing any of that. And I think more and more artists are kind of being frank about that and having those open discussions. And as fans, of course, we want to go and support the artist. That's part of why we're buying to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
I think it was an interesting point that people ask about being a musician with record collecting, because that's not something that I've thought about before or personally been asked. But something that I have noticed is maybe the way that men and women share or consume information about musicians that they like. And I feel like men or male identifying people maybe that are into sports, for example, have this like crazy amount of knowledge about specific players and stuff like that. And I feel like that kind of thing also sometimes translates to music, where I find more men go down this like rabbit hole of like, this person was in this band and they're in this band and they play this instrument and this kind of thing. And I feel like women maybe, at least from my perception, aren't as in that same space. Do you think, was that something that you found, or do you think that that's something that maybe separates how we are sharing and collecting?
Yeah, I think that has to do with that idea of dissemination of information and what's important to the different collectors, and how we're told to interact with the information. I think in many ways, men and male presenting people are told that kind of flaunt this knowledge, talk about the knowledge, whereas women aren't necessarily taught the same thing. That don't brag about what you know. And no specific, like in Sweden we have a specific word for it, jantelagen. Don't make people aware of how much knowledge you have, because then you'll seem better than them. And very specifically applied to women of, don't let them know that you know this.
Right.
So that I think plays part in it. And it's a bit of a funny story, but so when I got married, we had Led Zeppelin all the way through the ceremony, walk down the aisle to Immigrant Song, because why not? But a couple of weeks later, I was giving a lecture with a man, a male colleague, and he just stopped in the middle of it and turned to me and went, "Veronica, have you heard of this band, Led Zeppelin?" I thought, are you kidding? Like, in front of all of the students, you're going to stop and say, "Have you heard of Led Zeppelin? Have you heard of me?" Yes, of course. But it was just like, what makes you think this is an appropriate discussion? Even if I hadn't heard of the band, why would you question such a thing? But that was like a normal exchange of information to them, apparently.
Oh
my God.
It's so
I
crazy.
mean, I think the fundamental way that you like understand music can form those kind of conversations, and your ability to have those conversations in a meaningful way. This conversation about composition and making music, then you're never going to be able to have a conversation about like the music that you like and why. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, Simon Frith wrote, well, I'm paraphrasing him. He said that to have any kind of meaningful discussion about music, we have to agree on a shared aesthetics first. And I very much believe that. I can talk about how this dance remix is the best thing ever, but if you're looking for something to relax to, then we're never going to agree on that. So we have to agree, okay, what is the shared aesthetics here? What are we looking for? But though the assumption of those shared aesthetics are usually male, are usually rock oriented,
Right.
and guitar dominated. So if you're anyone who encroaches on that, there's also a sense of we have to kind of put you down a little so you don't threaten our power, and you don't kind of upset the status quo. But yeah, I see a lot of that. And it's a constant struggle in popular music overall.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's validating for me. So I like that, because I was like, am I crazy? Am I the only person that has to say why I don't like jazz? Because like I work in a record store.
I don't like jazz either.
Yeah. I mean, I do think jazz is one of those areas where it is a more male genre.
Yeah.
It also has a lot of audiophile inherently qualities to it. So I think that also creates sort of like the technical barrier for a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that makes complete sense.
I just don't any music that's like, oh, you have to come to us to understand it. It's like, no, music should kind of be accessible to the people, democratize it.
Are you a producer, engineer, or broadcaster? Do you want to be? Either way, Nugent Audio is for you. Nugent creates innovative, intuitive, professional audio tools for high-end music producers, post-production engineers, and broadcasters. Their products make it easier to deliver better quality, save time, and reduce cost. As a Women in Vinyl podcast listener, you get 20% off your next Nugent Audio purchase using code WOMENINVINYL. Go to nugentaudio.com/womeninvinyl. And now, back to the episode.
Veronica, do you see specific differences when it comes to our rainbow crowd? Like the LGBTQIA2+.
So, in my research, they have been much more hesitant to kind of be forthcoming and sharing. And I think that's because of all the barriers they face generally in society, that this is just another one of those things. So, I don't really have enough information to speak of patterns as such, apart from just the same discrimination applies that kind of women face, they face as well, very much. I have seen that a lot of gay men are carving a space for them in a kind of pop community, which I think is great. And they are, I don't want to say leading, but they're kind of showcasing of this is how it can be done and opening other doors for people, which is very interesting. And I hope that can spread to other genres and other identities as well. But yeah, there's still a lot of fear in kind of opening up and sharing that information.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's hard enough just to exist day to day.
Yeah, no kidding. And do you think that's just like hesitancy to share with you as a researcher, or hesitancy like in the general kind of space?
I think it's a little bit of both, because researchers historically have not been kind, unfortunately. So a lot of it is kind of cultural trauma that lives on. So any kind of marginalized communities are generally more hesitant. And even in terms of women who maybe have less cause for hesitation, I found that if I interact with them in the first instance as a researcher, it can be very difficult. Whereas if I start a conversation just as a collector, then it's much easier. And they say, well, actually, I also do this. But that, of course, poses certain challenges as a researcher, because we're taught be objective and kind of remove yourself from it. And it's like, well, if I remove myself as a collector from it, then I can't conduct the research.
Right.
Did you find anything in the research speaking to women about kind of the sexualization of sharing their records? Was there a reason that they felt like that empowered them more or allowed them to be part of the conversation in a way? Or was there anything that you found on that? Because I know that that's sort of a hot topic on social media, especially like that, what is it, vinyl community, Instagram. Like a lot of people get real hot about the fact that like the top 10 are all women posing with their records. Did you find anything about that as far as empowerment or why that was a trend?
I found a lot of people who claimed it was about empowerment. I couldn't actually find anyone who kind of enacted that. That's not to say they're not out there, but I didn't come across anyone who kind of exhibited all of that, of saying, I'm doing this for me, I'm doing it because I want to, and at the same time didn't say anything that was kind of flagging something of them, are you sure, without wanting to kind of reveal anything too personal or identifying. That was a very difficult part to write about, because I felt like it did need to be addressed, because like you say, the top posts are always about some kind of sexualized woman. And the comments are usually not very kind either. It's either something of, come home to my bed or something, or why do you have to dress like a slut to kind of showcase the record collector? So there was no winning at whatever you did. And again, I think the kind of root cause, as far as I can see, is that notion of, if you present a sexualized image with a record, you almost become technology yourself, in the views of the public, in that kind of male gaze, and that becomes easier to process. And then even if you know something about the records, you're not a threat, because you're not a human anymore, you're an object. So that was very, very tricky, difficult, but yeah, no one spoke positively about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard, even like with Women in Vinyl, because we specifically try to showcase people working in the industry and to try to remove some of that from how we present everybody that we're showcasing and empowering. but we do get a lot of tags of women in their underwear with photos, and I have to hide us from that. Like I remove it from our shared stuff because it's not how we're trying to represent the empowerment of these women. It's like if that empowers you, that's fine, but like that's not how we want to create a role model aesthetic. And it's very tricky because in some way I feel bad about doing that, but it is something at the same time that doesn't represent our community.
I think maybe we just need to have a bit more progress on gender in general and women's sexuality in a record collecting community before it can be accessible to the public in an empowering way. Like I said, maybe it's empowering to individuals at the moment, but to be empowering for a community, I think we need to further along a little bit. Because the most common thing I saw was women who weren't presenting themselves in any kind of sexual way, constantly getting harassed and being asked for feet pictures in particular. So it's like, well, clearly, even if you're not engaging with that, you are getting hit by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had those messages myself, and it's just great.
Yeah.
We all know that the kind of hidden folder is hidden for a reason.
Thanks for that hidden folder.
Yeah.
Ugh. Ugh.
I know.
Woof.
For me, I've always been very loud, and a few years ago, for lots of different reasons, my voice was silenced, and I kind of spent a long time reflecting over that and why does this bother me? And obviously, things happened that I wasn't kind of happy about, but the big part was really the notion that I wasn't in control of my own narrative. And since then, I realized that, okay, obviously there's only so many people I can reach by speaking out and being vocal about things. But when I do that, one, I feel like something's happening and we can have a discussion about things. And those discussions are going further than just me. So it's very much a case from my point of view that just keep talking about things. And if you're able to, obviously there are people who don't feel comfortable sharing, which is absolutely fine as well. But if you are comfortable being loud about kind of your practices, why things are difficult, or any challenges that you face, they have a big impact, and do really spread.
Okay. So we change everything and make it more comfy in record stores. I mean, that's probably the first place that we can make the biggest difference. And then it extends into the internet, and then into hopefully all of these spaces that we're trying to train and educate people about that they can go work in. I mean, this seems like a totally doable thing, right?
Yeah, and to make it even more doable, kind of one of the calls I made in the book was to try and form some kind of network for independent shops so they have a bit more support but can also share information. But obviously that requires a bit of funding. So if the governments want to fund record shops to kind of get a network going, I think that would be very beneficial.
Awesome.
Well, just to open that a little bit more, what do you mean a network? What kind, being somebody that works in a record store, like what kind of information and things could I share with someone, like with another independent record store?
Well, even if they find that certain consumers are scared to go into the back room, maybe we put a couple of nice records at the front that they feel like, okay, if I recognize this is an inviting space, I can trust this to go in a bit deeper into it. And maybe there's a way of kind of sharing more formal education rather than just that informal stuff of being in the shop itself. And I had a couple of independent shops that felt like they didn't know enough about the other shops nearby them. And I thought, well, okay, that seems like we're missing a trick there then.
Yeah.
Maybe it's unusual, but here in Calgary, we have like a weird little record store collective where we're all kind of buds. We all have our own little niche of the population that we service. So we often say, oh, well, we don't have it, but Sloth Records might, or Blackbird definitely would, because they do this really well. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's just unique to my city. But I mean, we're only a city of 1 million people, so it's a little bit more achievable. I think we have 9 record stores here.
Yeah, the closest thing I found was generally like very informal Facebook groups, so sharing information about shoplifters and things like that, and think, well, we can go further than that.
Yeah. No, okay. Well, that's good to know. Awesome.
Yeah, and I know you don't have a specific release day yet, but can you tell people a little bit about where to find the book when it is available, what its name is, where to keep an eye out?
So, the book is called The Vinyl Revival, Gender and Collecting Aesthetics. And I think the best place is probably Routledge website when it does come out. It tries not to look too much at the historical side of things. There is a little bit of background historical context, but very much focused on right now, with a huge chapter on gender that hopefully will have the impact that kind of I was fueling into it, writing it. Got a chapter looking at some specific record shops as well that are very good. So if anyone's in Gothenburg, definitely go to Bengans there. That's one of my favorites, and it's just a lovely place. Lots of different genres there as well. And yeah, I think that's the main bits.
Awesome. Well, we'll of course share when it's out.
Well, and you referenced a first book too, so let's shout out your first book as well.
So the first book has a longer title.
Writing one book is crazy. Writing 2 books, I mean, lady, what? Wow.
Yeah, and for some reason I decide that I want to write it in like this really condensed period. I do the research and then I just sit down and just write, and it's interesting.
I love it.
So, but yes, the first book is called I, Me, Mine, an initial consideration of popular music, record collecting, aesthetics, identities, and practices.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah. So your first release is an LP and this is an EP.
Yes, exactly. But that is more case of record collecting in the 20th century, and it looks a lot at prog rock. It looks a little bit at Vertigo Records, which I revive in this book as well, because it's a vinyl revival. So let's revive the label again. But yeah, that's the more historical bit, and this is more the kind of contemporary bit. But I'm pretty confident that if you manage to spell my surname right, you will find both books, because it's a very specific name.
Okay, so let's spell that out again for everybody.
It's Skrimsjo.
Okay, excellent. So everybody should go get both of her books. I'm waiting with bated breath for the second one to come out so that I can read it, and then maybe we'll all do like hot take chapter reads on our Instagrams to be like, all right, team, live reading. Here we go. Guess what?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, I like that. Cool. Jen, do you want to ask the final and most difficult question in the entire world?
Yes. So as you probably know, we always ask someone an impossible question at the end, which is if you could create your own 7-inch and put any song on the A side and any song on the B side, what would you choose?
On the A side, I would put Carry On by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And on the B side, I would put Wait by the Beatles.
Awesome.
I mean, leave it to the researcher to be so prepared. Hey,
she was prepared.
I was
100%.
I was ready. I was so ready. I was like, "Ooh, this is good." She's gonna be like, "Oh, I have no idea," but of course, she's like, "Oh yes, actually." Great job, Veronica. We're so blessed and happy to have you on the podcast to share your brilliance, obviously. But we're so blessed to have you work so closely with us, with Women in Vinyl too. I mean, I can't speak for Jen, but I like to speak along with her sometimes. So I just want to say thank you so much. We're so grateful.
Oh no, thank you for having me. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Right,
oh yeah. Big plans for 2024, baby.
Oh yeah, sounds good.
Well, have a good evening.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
All right, bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Women in Vinyl podcast. you can join our ever-growing list of sponsors. Other record labels: Selector, Couple Design, Eargasm, Groove Washer, Glowtronics, New Gen Audio, and Vinyl Revolution Record Show. And thanks for sponsoring the show. Hey, as always, you can join our conversation on Instagram or send us a note at media@womeninvinyl.com. Clock us, send us info. If you have a question, we got the answer, or we'll find it. We won't lie to you. And check out womeninvinyl.com for past episodes, the store, the job board, and the library of resources. Don't forget to like and subscribe and give us a review on your favorite podcast delivery method. You can also contribute to furthering our mission at patreon.com/womeninvinyl. Hey, guess what? This episode, 45 minutes. You know there was more. You want more? You get more. Go to patreon.com and you can get more. And you'll find all the B-sides, the deep cuts, and the amazing extras, including longer episodes, and contribute to the creation of scholarships and educational opportunities to further the demystification, the infiltration of more women and non-binary identifying humans into the vinyl making space, decreasing those turnaround times every week. Yeah, we love your records. We want you to love them too. womeninvinyl.com.
This episode has been brought to you by Women in Vinyl and Red Spade Records. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe, and you can always contact us directly by visiting www.womeninvinyl.com.